The year 1960 opened with a show trial. The Soviet Union put American pilot Gary Powers in the dock after it shot down his U-2 spy plane. Communist Party chief Nikita Khrushchev visited an exhibition of the remains of the U-2 and used the opportunity to embarrass the United States government. He also embarrassed Britain's Prime Minister Harold Macmillan by interrupting his speech at the United Nations, which supported the Americans. Macmillan had caused his share of embarrassment by warning his South African hosts that their system of apartheid must change. Within weeks came the Sharpeville massacre of 56 anti-apartheid protesters. But in the United States, the election victory of 43-year-old John F. Kennedy did seem to promise a new beginning. In Buenos Aires, capital of Argentina, a man was being hunted for the crime of planning the murder of 10 million people. He said his name was Ricardo Clement, but the Israeli Secret Service was certain that he was SS Chief Adolf Eichmann. A special squad had watched his house in the suburbs for weeks. Then, on the 11th of May 1960, it followed a bus on which he was traveling home. As he waited for his connection, 4 men grabbed him and hustled him into a car. They rushed him to a hideout, where he protested they had the wrong man. So they checked his medical details, put an SS cap on his head, and compared it with this photo. They had caught the chief organizer of the Nazi Holocaust. As Argentina prepared to celebrate its Independence Day, Eichmann was taken in disguise to the airport. Given the choice of instant death or standing trial, he had agreed to go to Israel. He was smuggled aboard the new plane service El Al had just instituted with solely this VIP passenger in mind, to be secretly transported to Tel Aviv. The announcement of his arrest caused a worldwide sensation. In Israel, there was triumph and relief. Of all the Nazi leaders who had escaped at the end of the war, none was more hated there than the architect and supervisor of the attempt to eliminate the Jewish race completely. But when the way it had been carried out became known, there was concern that international law had been flouted in the pursuit of a greater justice. A diplomatic incident flared up when Argentina demanded that he be sent back. But this was treated with scorn at the United Nations by spokeswoman Golda Meir.
Is this a problem for the Security Council to deal with? This is a body that deals with threats to peace. Is this a threat to peace? Eichmann brought to trial by the very people to whose total physical annihilation he dedicated all his energies.
Her strong stance gained the world's respect, and Israel went ahead with preparations for the trial. A community center in Jerusalem was turned into a cross between a courtroom and a theater. Eichmann asked to be represented by Dr. Robert Servatius, who flew in from Germany. He had been a counsel for the defense at the Nuremberg trials. Anxious to show that the trial would be as fair as possible, the State of Israel paid his $25,000 fee and made all the documents in the case available to him. Meanwhile, his client was talking freely to his captors, alternately awarding himself a major place in history and protesting that he was only a minor cog in a well-oiled wheel. As the day of his trial approached, police took extreme measures to protect the man every Israeli hated. Crowds filled the streets when the trial began on the 11th of April, 1961. Inside the specially prepared courtroom, a bulletproof glass booth had been prepared. Eichmann was led in surrounded by policemen. The prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, watched his quarry as the court rose for the entry of the 3 judges who were to try the case. They were immediately faced with a complaint that the crimes had not been committed in the land of the trial and that the judges were Jewish and thus prejudiced. The three judges ruled that they were no more prejudiced than judges in a case of theft were prejudiced against thieves. Eichmann then prepared to hear the indictment against him.
I will read the indictment to you, and it will be translated for you into the German. Tell him that he can remove the earphones now.
The Criminal Code Ordinance 1936, particulars of offense. The accused, together with others, during the period 1939 to 1945, caused the killing of millions of Jews in his capacity as the person responsible for the execution of the Nazi plan for the physical extermination of the Jews, known as the final solution of the Jewish problem.
There were 12 counts in all, adding up to a devastating indictment of having caused the death of millions of Jews in the concentration camps. Eichmann was accused of having organized the whole complex business of transporting Jews from all over Europe to their deaths. He had done this knowing that he was sending them to enslavement, starvation, and extermination. He had been instrumental in setting up the huge concentration camps in which Jews suffered hideous medical experiments and sterilization before their deaths. He was identified as one of the leading figures in the development of the gas chambers in which millions died and the ovens in which their bodies were disposed of. There was a specific charge that he had deported 100 children from the Czech village of Lidice to be murdered in Poland. Early on in the trial, the prosecution established that Eichmann had always tried to keep his activities well hidden. His name and the senior level at which he operated only became apparent during the Nuremberg war crimes trials of Nazi leaders such as Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess. It was at Nuremberg that the whole concept of crimes against humanity, under which the Nazis were tried and condemned, became accepted as part of international law. Over the next 6 weeks, dozens of witnesses testified to their experiences in the camps. All were volunteers with appalling tales to tell, but few had had any direct contact with Eichmann or could place specific guilt on the man. Eichmann had pleaded not guilty and had claimed that he was only a minor bureaucrat carrying out orders for which he was not responsible. But steadily a case was built up to show that he had been a major organizer of the Nazis' killing machine and that he had been fully aware of what he was doing. The court had to face the question of how humanity, after centuries of civilization, could descend to such barbaric and sadistic behavior. In one story, which was typical of the many appalling incidents which the court heard about, this witness told how she had been lined up and shot at with a crowd of other victims. Somehow the firing squad missed her, and she found herself being thrown into a mass grave, still breathing. When she was sure that all the guards had left, she forced her way through a tangle of corpses and managed to get to freedom. Karl Adolf Eichmann had refused to take the oath in court. Possibly this was part of his rejection of his father and his strict evangelical upbringing. He had been born in Germany in 1906, but his family moved to Linz in Austria before the First World War. By his early 20s, he was fervently anti-Jewish and a natural supporter of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, which was steadily growing amid the chaos of Weimar Germany. Eichmann joined the Nazi Party and was soon given responsibility for fulfilling Hitler's aim of driving all citizens of Jewish descent out of Germany. At first, this was planned in secrecy, but then, as Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, his aims became more obvious. One of the first acts of the new Chancellor was to exclude Jews from the civil service. Then, in 1935, came the Nuremberg laws, which deprived them of their citizenship rights and forbade marriage with non-Jewish Germans. By now, Eichmann was a trusted member of Heinrich Himmler's SS. Working behind the scenes and careful not to take the spotlight himself, Eichmann built up a reputation as a reliable party man and excellent administrator. Although he was to claim in court that he had been mainly concerned with trying to find the Jews an alternative homeland in the Middle East or Africa and helping them to emigrate there, in reality he was given the responsibility for organizing what was to be the Nazis' public declaration of war on the Jews, the infamous Kristallnacht. On this night of the broken glass, on November the 9th, 1938, 20,000 Jews were arrested and a significant number killed. Synagogues and more than 7,000 Jewish shops were looted and burned. Their broken windows gave the occasion its name. Insurance companies were excused making reimbursements. The following month, torchlight parades heralded an official ban on all Jewish businesses, and they were forbidden to deal in property and jewelry or to own securities. Eichmann was ordered to make the Reich Jew-free. On the surface, Germany's streets seemed normal, but Jews were stripped of all their remaining rights, and a large proportion of them were sent to concentration camps. Because the first two at Dachau and Buchenwald were soon filled, Eichmann organized a new one at Mauthausen. In the courtroom, one witness testified that it was at this time that Adolf Eichmann was said to have coined the most chilling phrase of the 20th century. On the main file in his Berlin headquarters, he wrote the words, "Final solution." No one was left in any doubt as to what he meant by this, or how thoroughly he was preparing to solve the Jewish problem. His opportunity to put his plans into effect was at hand. Hitler gave the order to attack Poland, and on the 30th of September 1939, the Second World War began. When Germany invaded Poland, Eichmann was put in charge of Department 4B4 of the Reich Security Head Office, responsible for deportation and emigration. Jewish property was seized, pogroms instituted, and death camps like Auschwitz were set up. His job was to move the millions of Jews, gypsies, dissident Catholics, communists, socialists, and resistance fighters into them. Within days of German troops entering Warsaw, Eichmann had ordered that all Jews over 6 years old should wear a yellow star. Then they were herded into ghettos and forbidden to leave under penalty of death. Before entering, even the children were searched for hidden food. Within months, tens of thousands died from starvation and disease. Herded into the main ghetto in Warsaw through the newly built wall were Jews from all over Poland. Eichmann encouraged them to elect their own leaders, which he then proceeded to bribe and browbeat into keeping order within the ghetto. Thus, as many troops as possible could be freed for the front line. Anyone who was in the least troublesome was marched away, never to be seen again. (1941) was the high point of the Third Reich. Its victorious troops had reduced Poland to slavery and occupied France, Holland, Denmark, Belgium, Norway, and the Balkans. Then came Hitler's final throw, the invasion of Russia. As the troops thrust forward, battalions of the SS followed, mopping up Jews and other undesirables, often shooting them without mercy. All pretense of emigration was dropped, as the function of Department 4B4 was redefined to give it full responsibility for Jewish affairs. But there were rumblings even in Nazi high command against the policy of open decimation. This is what happened in hundreds of towns and villages in Russia as Eichmann's special squads moved in. Some German generals complained that the morale of troops was being harmed by such ruthless methods. Such visible slaughter was upsetting. But in December 1941, German hopes of a quick end to the war in Russia were dashed. A massive Soviet counterattack threw back the troops which had reached the outskirts of Moscow, and it became apparent that a much longer war was in prospect. The scale of the populations to be exterminated now presented a major problem, and at a conference called at this villa in Wannsee outside Berlin in January 1942, it was decided to step up the final solution. Eichmann presented a detailed program based on the use of gas chambers, which he had already been experimenting with in Poland, and his immediate superior, Reinhard Heydrich, gave him the green light to go ahead. Soon the greatest mass murder that the world has ever known was underway. In one camp alone, Auschwitz-Birkenau, 9,000 people were killed every 24 hours. Not only 6 million Jews were eliminated, but the whole of Europe's gypsy population, as well as innumerable perceived enemies of Nazism, including communists, social democrats, conservatives, Protestants, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and anyone else considered troublesome. Everyone knew that at the center of this vast obscene web sat the man in the glass booth. But knowledge is one thing, legal proof is another. And so the witnesses followed one another, this one, a Polish novelist named Jehiel Dinur, producing his concentration camp uniform. Faced with the emotional nightmare of telling what happened at Auschwitz, he faltered during cross-examination by the chief prosecutor, and then fainted. On only one occasion were the prosecutors able to produce a witness who claimed to have seen Eichmann personally commit a murder. Abraham Gordon saw him order the killing of a young boy who had eaten some of his cherries. Just one murder out of millions, but one that made him personally responsible. Now came the turn of the defense, led by Robert Servatius. His theme was that his client was not a leader, only a minor functionary. Adolf Eichmann listened mildly, as though his life was not in the balance. Throughout the world, the survivors were listening too, remembering their children marched away to the ovens. Although Eichmann had done his best to cover his tracks, he found it difficult to explain away his signature on many incriminating documents. But at the end of the war, very little of his involvement had yet come to light. He was able to lose himself among the hundreds of thousands of returning German troops, and using the name Ekman, he was released. For 4 years, he worked on a farm in Germany before being spirited away to Argentina by the Odessa network, organized by former SS colleagues. There he found a new identity as Ricardo Clement. His wife joined him, and they built a new life. When prosecutor Hausner rose to cross-examine him, Eichmann continued to try to insist that he had only played a minor role and had never been a fervent Nazi. He was asked to be specific as to where and why he had joined the party. He replied, "In Austria, where I established the first contacts with the party. As I said before, I did not join the party because of their program aimed at the destruction of the Jews. The prosecutor suggested to him that from as early as 1937, Eichmann's specific and main activity was the fight against the Jews.
You were active on was the fight against Jews and not the
Juden war und nicht gegen Versailles.
Eichmann was forced to admit that this was the case from the time he took charge of Department 4B4, which had been given responsibility for deportations and immigration. At times, Eichmann's excuses became too much for the spectators, most of whom had lost their loved ones in his camps. The presiding judge attempted to maintain order. One damning piece of evidence produced by the prosecution was a letter from Eichmann direct to Heinrich Himmler, confirming that 6 million Jews had been murdered. The prosecutor's merciless questioning lasted for 2 weeks, and he produced document after document which showed the depth of Eichmann's knowledge and involvement. Throughout, as in this exchange about whether he knew that the special squads or Einsatzgruppen had been specifically ordered to carry out exterminations, Eichmann insisted that he had only been carrying out orders, not giving them. He was asked to explain the instructions he had given as to how the Einsatzgruppen were to report the numbers they had killed, and was forced to admit that these orders had assumed a policy of extermination. However, even when he had to agree that he was guilty of carrying out deportations, he insisted that he was only a minor administrator and that others were equally guilty. This remained his claim to the end. When the judges retired to debate his guilt, Eichmann was allowed out in the sunshine, perhaps for the last time. On the 16th of December 1961, the judges returned to the courtroom with their verdict. There was little doubt what that would be, and the man who planned and carried out what are really uncounted and uncountable numbers of deaths heard himself found guilty. He seemed unrepentant as the death sentence was demanded. The court sentenced him to hang, and Eichmann was taken away to Ramle prison to await execution. The Israeli Supreme Court rejected his appeal, and a personal plea to the Israeli president was turned down. Eichmann went to the gallows on the 31st of May, 1962. The news of the death of one of the world's worst mass murderers was received on a cold winter's day in Germany. There was little surprise that the people of Israel had decided that this was the only way to repay the debt to their tortured and buried parents, brothers, sisters, friends, and children. People read how Eichmann's corpse had been cremated and the ashes taken out to sea beyond the territorial waters of Israel and scattered. The soil of the Jewish state could not be sullied by the remains of this man. But the execution of Eichmann was only one victory in the campaign led by dedicated Nazi hunters such as former camp inmate Simon Wiesenthal, who devoted his life to tracking them down. He swiftly appeared on television to confirm that the hunt would go on. And for years it did throughout South America for men such as Joseph Mengele, until it was proved that the man who had conducted hideous medical experiments in the camps had died in an accident. But a quarter of a century later, in 1987, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was discovered and brought back to France to be condemned to life imprisonment for his crimes. As long as human memory remains, we must remember the Holocaust. It was conceived on a scale so vast and motivated by an evil so obscene that to this day some people still refuse to believe it could have happened. But it did.